Warriors, welcome back to Gods of Alliance. If you're here, it means you want power, knowledge, and control over the battlefield. This is not luck. This is strategy. And today, we are talking about a hero that proves something many players still underestimate in hero wars. Because people look at damage, people look at burst, people look at giant numbers, and think that is what wins battles. But damage means nothing if the enemy never gets to play. And that is where Polaris enters. The Frozen Star, one of the cleanest examples of battlefield control ever introduced into the Dominion. Because Polaris does not dominate through raw destruction. She dominates through interruption, through timing, through pressure, through making sure your opponent never reaches the fight they wanted to play. And once you understand that, everything about her suddenly starts making sense. Because Polaris is not a defensive hero. She is an offensive control engine. Her entire design revolves around creating moments where the enemy loses rhythm, loses momentum, loses access to their strongest windows, while your team quietly takes control of the battlefield. And Warriors. That obstacle she creates in front of the front line already tells the entire story. At first glance, it looks simple, a structure, a barrier, something enemies must break. But that is not what it really is. That obstacle is bait, because every hit enemies place into it becomes value for Polaris. Every strike gives her additional energy. Every attempt to break through accelerates her game plan. And suddenly, the enemy realizes something terrifying. The more aggressively they attack, the faster Polaris starts controlling. This completely changes how some teams behave, especially frontline-focused teams, physical pressure teams, compositions that rely on continuous attacks and constant tempo. They start hitting. They expect progress. Instead, they feed the Frozen Star. And once Polaris starts gaining that energy, everything changes. Because her ultimate is not just another stun. Her ultimate changes the pace of battle. Enemies stop attacking. Skills stop rotating. Dodges stop happening. Everything slows down. And Warriors. Timing wins. Hero wars. Not just damage. Timing. The team that creates cleaner rotations usually wins. The team that reaches skills first usually wins. The team that controls tempo usually wins. And Polaris attacks all of those things simultaneously. She removes rhythm. She interrupts momentum. She decides when enemies are allowed to move. That alone would already make her powerful. But then, Radiance appears. And this is where Polaris transforms from annoying into terrifying. Because now, stunning is no longer just control. It becomes amplification. Whenever Polaris, or her allies, stun enemies that are already stunned, Radiance activates. And suddenly enemies begin taking increased magic damage. Now think about what that means. Enemies are trapped. Enemies cannot respond. Enemies cannot rotate properly. And while all of that is happening, your damage dealers become stronger. Your mages become deadlier. Your pressure becomes heavier. That is not random design. That is control, becoming damage. This is why Polaris scales so well. One stun becomes another. One interruption becomes another. Control turns into pressure. Pressure turns into damage. Damage turns into victory. And because she creates cycles instead of isolated moments, fights slowly become impossible to recover. That is why experienced players hate facing Polaris. Not because she kills instantly, but because she slowly removes every possibility to recover. Now, Warriors. Control heroes always become more dangerous with the right teammates. And Polaris has some beautiful combinations. Let's start with Judge. Because this pairing feels incredibly clean. Judge slows enemies. Judge protects allies. Judge creates additional control opportunities. And suddenly Polaris receives exactly what she wants. More safe rotations. More battlefield order. More stun windows. Judge's shields create breathing room. His effects extend her influence. His own control triggers more opportunities for Radiance. Now Polaris is no longer controlling alone. She starts expanding. This is what wisdom synergy looks like. Control through structure. Control through precision. Control through discipline. But then we move to Orion and Warriors. This combination changes the feeling completely because Orion turns control into punishment. Polaris creates openings. Orion fills them with damage. Enemies lose tempo. Enemies lose movement. Enemies lose opportunities. And Orion starts unloading pressure into those windows. This combination feels explosive because now Polaris is not simply controlling anymore. Now she is enabling destruction. One hero freezes the battlefield. The other one punishes everyone trapped inside it. That is strength. Now let's move into something much more aggressive. Folio. This one is dangerous. Because yes, you lose faction synergy, but you gain burst. You gain unpredictability. You gain battlefield chaos. Folio destabilizes positioning, creates disruption, creates pressure. And Polaris loves that because grouped enemies become easier to stun. Broken formations create easier Radiance triggers. And suddenly both heroes begin overwhelming entire teams together. This combination doesn't feel controlled. It feels explosive. The battlefield becomes impossible to organize, and enemies simply collapse under combined pressure. But Warriors, if there is one combination that deserves respect, it is Polaris and Iris. Because this is business. Polaris stuns. Iris destroys. Polaris slows. Iris melts. Polaris amplifies magic damage. Iris converts that amplification into devastation. And suddenly enemies stop functioning. Dodge teams lose their biggest strength. Aggressive teams lose momentum. Defensive teams lose time. And while everyone remains trapped, Iris quietly ends the fight. This combination feels oppressive. And that is why Polaris remains so relevant. Because she does not depend on numbers. She depends on mechanics. And mechanics age beautifully. Damage changes. Meta changes. But preventing enemies from acting? That never becomes weak. So Warriors, should you invest? Absolutely. Especially if you enjoy magic teams. Especially if you enjoy battlefield control. Especially if you enjoy watching enemies slowly realize they are no longer playing their game. Because Polaris is not built for fast victories. She is built for inevitable victories. She slows. She controls. She amplifies. And eventually, she takes over. Warriors, this is how we play the game. Not randomly, not blindly, with knowledge, with precision, with control. We don't build randomly. We build with intention. Master the mechanics. Control the fight. Let's break the game together.